And muting. Welcome. Tonight we are really excited for our very first Tuesday educational series, and we're excited to have Andrea Dalton, who's going to talk about becoming trauma informed. But before she starts, I want to go through a quick introduction of NAMI in case there are anybody on this call who may not be familiar with what we do. My name is Kelly Jackson. I'm the executive director here in Johnson County, Kansas, with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So we do have a few great things coming up, gosh, in the next couple of weeks. And just to highlight what NAMI does, we focus on improving the lives of people who have been touched by mental illness, whether they live with mental illness themselves or they have a loved one with that. And we do that by offering support through support groups, education in our classes, and advocacy to make sure people are getting the best care possible. The best part is that we are a volunteer organization with everyone has lived experience. So they either have a family member or a friend with mental health conditions or live with a mental health condition themselves. So this gives a really unique perspective to the way that we care for our community. And then, of course, we are connected to our local resources. So a key goal of ours is to make sure that we are aware of the local resources that people can utilize and how to best utilize them. So coming up this week, we have Family to Family. It starts this Thursday. And if anyone has a loved one with a mental health condition, this class is an absolute game changer. It teaches you about the biology of the brain, the biology of mental illness, how medication works, how different therapeutic processes work, insurance and other resources available if our loved one doesn't have insurance or they're on Medicaid or Medicare. Tons of self-care tips and de-escalation and communication tips. This is a free class that we offer, and don't miss it. So if you have a loved one with a mental health condition, please register for Family to Family. It starts this Thursday at Church of the Resurrection on 95th and Antioch in Overland Park. And our next First Tuesday is going to be in March. So save the date for March 4th. We have Tara Triplett with Janssen gosh, I can't read my slide. Sorry. But they are sponsoring a time called Hope for Schizophrenia, and we are going to have dinner. It's going to be in person. So registration will come out if you are a part of our weekly email. You'll see registration links for that. We're really excited about this event. And if you know anybody with schizophrenia or has a loved one with schizophrenia, this would be a great time to come out and hear this presentation. And then, of course, as we're in winter, being away from the home to get to to support group might be a little bit tough. We do have a number of online support groups that we do offer. And the next one we have coming up is our parent-to-parent group. And this is for people who have a child with a mental health condition or are a guardian or caretaker of someone with a mental health condition. So if the child is under 18, then we encourage you to join this support group to learn from other parents and gain resources in our local community. We also have our virtual family support group and our Connections peer support group that is every other week. And once again, I say this all the time, you can go to namijoco.org/calendar. All of our events and registration are located there, as well as you're welcome to email namijoco@gmail.com. And of course, our resource line number, and all of our social media handles. This presentation is recorded and will be put on our YouTube site. So look for that in the coming days, and you'll be able to watch this again or share it with a friend. So now I'm going to pass it off to Vicki Meek.
Hello, welcome. I hope everybody's staying warm and cozy during this little winter wonderland that we're having. I'm very happy to introduce Andrea Dalton, who is the director of the Center for Trauma-Informed Innovation at University Health, also used to be formerly known as Truman Medical Center. A little bit about Andrea. She worked for nearly 12 years as a board-certified music therapist, primarily in inpatient mental health units in the Kansas City area. She took on the unique opportunity as a trauma-informed care consultant, there we go, spit it out, in 2016, building on her underlying fascination with the way the brain works, a critical appreciation for research, her creative spirit, and a strong commitment to make the world a better place for all people. Andrea currently works as the director of the Center for Trauma-Informed Innovation at University Health developing trauma-informed, culturally responsive programs, practices, and policies in partnership with schools, healthcare providers, social service agencies, and organizations in the business sector across the country. Her topic tonight is becoming trauma informed. And in this session, she is going to explore the prevalence of trauma as well as its impact on brains, bodies, and behaviors. Participants will be introduced to principles and practice of being trauma informed that support compassionate care and resilience for oneself and the community. And when I asked her three things she hopes that we can have our takeaways after tonight is to recognize the prevalence and impacts of trauma, explore the commitments and actions of being trauma informed, and discuss ways to respond to someone experiencing the effects of trauma. And she hopes that you will be able to answer these questions. What is trauma informed care? How can each person apply the commitments and actions of trauma informed care? Where can you learn more? So, Andrea, I'm so glad to have you tonight. I will try to monitor the chat, but I know Andrea she's got a couple of things in her presentation that she's going to probably ask you to contribute either verbally or via chat. So I'm looking forward to our time with Andrea, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Vicki. Thank you, everybody, for joining tonight. I'm going to put in the chat a handout packet, a PDF handout packet. So if you want to keep some of these slides for later, I put a few other little bonus handouts in there too. Happy to share those. Give me just 1 second to get that for you. And you all are NAMI folks, you're welcome to share that. If you want to put a link to it somehow on the video when you put that on YouTube, that's fine too. We were talking earlier about techie stuff, and I've gotten really good at techie stuff in the last 5 years because so much of our work had to move virtual in 2020. And so kind of navigating all of that, I've learned a lot about making things accessible in all those different ways. So that experience, I would say, of a pandemic is a shared trauma that like all of us have now. And I think that has really shaped us in so many ways and continues to, honestly, as we keep moving through that. I actually just learned of a death of someone that I knew, kind of tangentially knew, but from COVID, just in the last couple of weeks. So that's not over, and that continues to affect us. Now, I'm not here to talk about COVID specifically. However, that is definitely something that comes up when we start talking about trauma and the impact that stress and all of those kinds of things have on us, on our brains, on our bodies, on our behaviors. What I'm going to talk about tonight is just sort of an introduction to these concepts around trauma-informed care. Some of you might already be familiar with trauma-informed care. You may have an understanding of trauma also from maybe your own experience or the experience of those that you live with or live near or friends with, family, seeing that in the world around us. I think we all come at this topic of trauma with our own experiences that does shape how we understand it. So what I'll share with you today is kind of the way I have come around to conceptualizing trauma and the ways that we can respond to it. I know that sometimes there are things that come up for us individually when we do start talking about trauma and stress. Sometimes we call those triggers. We have stopped actually using the word triggers as much in our work and through the Center for Trauma-Informed Innovation for a couple of reasons. Triggers itself kind of is a trigger sometimes for people. And so, just to kind of avoid the negative connotations that has had for people, but also we've started using the word activation or activator because that's actually a little bit more neurologically what's happening when we encounter something that is a reminder of a previous experience that we've had that's been negative for us in some way. It activates our stress response. So I'll talk about that a little bit tonight. But I wanted to say that up front just because sometimes when we do talk about these things, it can activate your stress response. And so I want to encourage you to take care of yourself. If you need to, step away momentarily, take a breath, push your feet into the floor. Sometimes that can be helpful for grounding. Do those things that work for you to help you stay present and take care of yourself. It may also be that you just need to leave this entirely. I'm not going to intentionally say anything. I hope that will, I don't have like anything in your face about it, but sometimes things activate us and we don't necessarily know where that comes from. So you may have to like just step away entirely and come back to it later and watch the video later on. That's totally fine. Just want you to know that that is a real experience, that you're not broken or wrong if that happens to you. You are human, and we all have those potential activators. So I do apologize if that would happen to anyone. And feel free to reach out to afterward if there are things that that I say or do that would be helpful to have reframed in a different way. I'm happy to get that kind of feedback also. I'm also going to do a little section at the end on how do we manage those things for ourselves, dealing with stress, dealing with activators, that idea of trauma-informed self-care. So you can hopefully look forward to that at the end as well. So this idea of becoming trauma-informed really is multifaceted. It's not just about the I work in a hospital system. So for us, it's not just about the patients that are served or the clients that we see in our outpatient clinics. It's also about how we treat each other, whether we're staff or volunteers or colleagues in whatever work you do. It's also about how we treat our neighbors and our friends and our families. And it's also about how we treat ourselves. So again, that concept of becoming trauma-informed is also about trauma-informed self-care. Now I know the word self-care might not always be everyone's favorite either. I have my own feelings about it, but I've chosen to use it. So that's kind of where I'm going to head today. Vicki outlined a few of those concepts. Feel free to type in the chat as we're going along if you have questions. I do have a couple of prompts. I would love for people to answer those in the chat or unmute and talk a little bit. Very, very happy to keep that conversational. This is a pretty small group tonight, so happy to do that. And yeah, I think with that, I want to just set a few agreements for a safe and brave space for this time together tonight. And I've borrowed these from a few different places. Some of them come up frequently as we do training in my department with people in lots of different sectors and areas of work, areas of the world, and having this opportunity to create a space where people can be comfortable or someone's drawing on my slides. Let me see if I can adjust that. Here we go. I'm going to just reshare, see if that'll remove that. That happens sometimes. The annotation can take over. Okay. So our agreements for a safe and brave space. The safe space really fosters comfort. Brave space, though, is about mutual learning and accountability. So sometimes when we start talking about trauma, there are some things that we might disagree on. There are some things that maybe we don't always understand about every other person who's coming to this conversation. And so being able to create a space where people can share and be able to check in on themselves and also check in on each other, kind of creating that psychologically safe space so that we can be curious and empowered and move forward in a way that's going to benefit everyone. So these norms include practicing active, judgment-free, and empathetic listening, respecting each other's differences and backgrounds, calling one another in as an invitation to learn, seeking understanding and not consensus. And like I said, please do that with me too. I mean, I was invited to speak here tonight, but I am not the final authority on any of these topics. I'm learning as we go, and I make mistakes too. So I want to hear about that, and so I can learn and do better. Be curious about intentions. Recognize that impact is more important than intention. Same time. Honoring differences between unsafe and uncomfortable. Hopefully right now where you are physically safe, and hopefully the topic won't make you too uncomfortable. But again, it could. So just recognizing those differences, acknowledging judgments and assumptions, remembering we all have bias, and using inclusive language, avoiding derogatory or stigmatizing language. I know that's a really important value for NAMI in general, and definitely something we try to ascribe to in doing trauma-informed care work too. And then finally, releasing control, privilege, and notions of being right. There are often many right ways or many different ways to look at experiences. So much of trauma is really an individual's interpretation of what has happened to them. And it can be difficult for people to move forward and heal from trauma if they are not in an environment where people accept that what happened to them may have happened to another person, but had a different outcome or was experienced in a different way. So these are some agreements that I hope you all will acknowledge with me tonight. Hoping to, for myself, stick with these as I move through this content. So I want to start with just a kind of a definition of what is trauma. I think a lot of times when we talk about trauma in the world, like if you hear about trauma on the news or something like that, we often hear about like the event that's happening. But really, the event is not what trauma is. Events potentially contribute to trauma, but trauma really is the energy that gets locked in the body as a result of that perceived threat to our safety from that potentially traumatic event. And it really becomes an injury that gets lodged in our nervous system, in our mind, and in our body. Traumatic experiences are often intense and overwhelming experiences. They often involve a lot of loss or threat to safety, harm to a person's physical or emotional well-being. Really anything that's too much, too soon, too fast for our nervous system to handle, especially if we can't resolve it quickly or we don't feel like we have a lot of support in the moment. Those are kind of the concepts that swirl around when we think of trauma. What's really interesting about trauma, I think, is that two people can go through the very same event, potentially traumatic event, and one person may come out with trauma and another person may not at all. Now, the impact of the stress during that event probably impacts both of those people in ways that are important to recognize. But it may not be trauma, it may not always be a traumatic response. And I think it's noteworthy that usually, the statistic is, I think somewhere between 7 to 10% of people who go through a major disaster event end up with a diagnosis of PTSD. So that means that the other 90 to 93% of people who went through that traumatic experience, potentially traumatic experience, don't have that level of long-lasting impact from the event. That doesn't mean, though, that they don't have a long-lasting impact from the event, because again, the stress response and the way that happens in our bodies, we do store that stressful energy, that response, those intense and overwhelming experiences do impact us, even if we don't have kind of the traditional diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So trauma, the impacts of trauma last long past that originating event and can be reactivated by reminders, cues in the environment. They can be very small things like a scent or even a thought or It could be a person, it can be the way someone moves. There are so many things that potentially can reactivate that. And part of the reason that that happens is because our brains take shortcuts in order to manage the onslaught of data that is coming into our brain all the time. And in order to sort out like what is dangerous and what is not, like how am I going to stay alive? That's really what our brain is trying to do, is keep us alive. When we have those whiffs of things that are reminders of those past potential threats, that can activate that stress response again. So I'm going to go into that in just a little more detail in a moment. Another important thing to recognize about trauma and its impact is the resources that we have available to us when we have a potentially traumatic experience. So part of the reason that two people can go through the same kind of event but come out with very different result is these internal and external resources. We all have different internal and external resources, and those internal and external resources change over time for us because of a lot of factors. Internal resources reside within us, within our person. Things like our hope, our optimism, if we have a sense of self or identity that's strong, our intellect, critical thinking, resourcefulness, problem solving, our faith, our faith encompasses religious faith as well as faith in other people, faith in ourselves, that belief that someone is looking out for us, our creativity, our self-expression, all of those internal resources help us manage difficult times. And then we also have external resources. So those are the things outside of us that give you strength, that help you navigate difficult circumstances. Things like food, money, having a job, having paid time off, transportation, access to any kind of services that you might need, having mentors and role models, especially mentors and role models who have similar experiences to you. That can be really important for navigating difficult circumstances. Supportive relationships, caregivers, whether those are caregivers that are more informal caregivers or formal caregivers like doctors, therapists. All of these elements of our external resources can be impacted also by our internal resources and vice versa. There is kind of a mutual relationship that goes on between our internal and external resources. Having solid external resources can a lot of times foster our internal resources. So going back to my COVID example that I talked about at the very beginning today, when COVID started, some people saw, being on lockdown as a great opportunity because they could work from home and they did have the resources to navigate, some of the challenges that otherwise, if you didn't have like a work from home job, if you had to think about some of my colleagues in the hospital, they still had to go in. I fortunately for me did not. But direct healthcare workers definitely had to be right in there. And the resources that they may have had or not had to make the decision on whether or not they were going to continue in that job. And like all of those kinds of things, sometimes we talk about privilege when we start talking about those types of resources that are available. That can influence our individual ability to navigate difficult circumstances. It can really cut down on our optimism or on our faith when those kinds of things are impacting our external resources. The internal and external resources really are protective factors. So if we have a good balance of internal and external resources available to us when a potentially traumatic event happens, we are less likely to have a traumatic impact. If we have, for instance, people who show up and provide for our basic needs, and also give us some of that love and care and personal connection, interpersonal connection during difficult circumstances, to know that you're not alone in the midst of a potentially traumatic event is very protective against developing PTSD, for instance. And how someone perceives themselves and the resources that are available to them is really what's important. Actually having them and believing that you have them are two different things. And so that perception is really, really important when it comes to understanding how some events might impact people. It's important to remember also that within that, we do make a lot of judgments about, well, they had all of this going for them. What happened? How did they end up this way after this event? And again, that's because we all have these individual perceptions and ability to access all of these resources at any given moment. So trying to label or describe a situation that happened to someone else is usually not in our best interest when we think about how do we respond to somebody who's had trauma. For us to say, oh, that was trauma or that wasn't trauma is probably not helpful. It's better to just listen to their experience. It's better to hear what they have to say about it, to hear their understanding of it, and then also to identify the strengths that they do have that grow from that. And I'll get to that a little bit more as we talk about commitments and actions. So when those internal and external resources are overwhelmed by an external threat, whether that threat is real in the moment or it's perceived, that is a situation in which we can experience trauma. That real or perceived bit is important because we don't have to actually be physically in danger in order to feel like we are in danger. And that sense of potential threat is just as real in our brains as an actual threat. And sometimes I think people don't always recognize the impact that can have, but living in constant fear, I mean, some of us have done that at times in our lives. That is as much of a trauma as actually being in a harmful situation. The fear of something happening in our brains is pretty much interpreted the same way as something happening. Our brains tend to evaluate our surroundings and our memories in pictures, and believing that something could happen puts that image in our mind, and our brains have a really hard time telling the difference between what's real and what's imagined unless we actually slow down and sort through it. If you're in a stress response, you don't have the capacity to slow down and think through it. And so I want to talk just a little bit about what is going on in our brains when we have a stress response. You've got a pretty good handout in that packet that I sent that unpacks the executive functions here, as well as what's going on in the other parts of the brain. I really like this 3 states brain model. We have pulled a lot of this information from Conscious Discipline, but lots of people have researched this in the past. I will say it's not an entirely accurate neurological model, but it is a really helpful theoretical concept for us to acknowledge how the stress response impacts different layers of our functioning, our cognitive functioning as human beings. So there's a whole lot more going on here than what I'm going to explain to you right now in our brains. This is very simplified. So if you're a neuroscientist, bear with me because you probably know more about this than I do. But I do appreciate the understanding that our executive function is really responsible for our self-control, our working memory, and our mental flexibility. And within that are things like our emotional regulation, our ability to resist impulses, our ability to motivate ourselves, to have like self-discipline and time management and willpower. A lot of times we think about those things at the beginning of the year. Our ability to focus, to choose what we're focusing on, to sort the files of what's happening around us, to make decisions in a thoughtful way, doing problem solving. All of those mental tasks that really make us very human are primarily guided by our executive function, our prefrontal cortex, so right here behind our forehead. When we have when we have a stressor, when we encounter a stressor or some threat to our physical or emotional well-being, what happens is we get heightened activation in our lower part of our brain, our brainstem, the stress response. Sometimes we call that the fight, flight, or freeze, or the fight or flight. There are lots of F words that can go with that: fight, flight, freeze. There's sometimes people talk about fawning. I've chosen to focus just on fight, flight, or freeze. Those are kind of the basic immediate responses that happen in that stress response. We call that the survival state because it is primarily concerned with keeping us alive. Our reactions to that perceived or real threat are automatic. It is not always what we might say is rational. It's not always thought out. In fact, it's never thought out. We just do it. Our brain just like takes over control, and what makes us an individual sort of just kind of gets shut down temporarily while we try to stay alive. That's really what that part of our brain is concerned with. So what happens is that in order to do that, in order for us to survive and not be taken over by trying to decide, like, is this really a threat or not? Let me weigh the pros and cons. Like, we don't have time for that in a potentially life-threatening situation. So what's happening then in our brains is when the stress response is activated, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. It's almost like it's just cut off from the rest of our brain. And that's a survival technique. I will say, just as a side note, I think what's really interesting, those of us who experience a lot of anxiety have a lot of activation in our executive state, oftentimes even in those stress response situations. So I think that's really interesting. And I am, that's like on my list of stuff to read more about. People with anxiety and ADHD, and autism, like there are all these emerging elements of research, brain research going on that are helping us to understand just even a little bit more what's going on in that neurodiversity that we all have. So probably more to come on that, but I just wanted to make a note about that. The other thing I want to say about the brain is that we also have this middle part, the emotional state. Sometimes we refer to the collection of parts in the brain as the limbic system that are tied to our sense of emotion, our sense of memory, our ability to like store memories and retrieve them, process emotions. We also have this function of the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, that is watching out for everything in our environment. So it's taking in all of this sensory input, both externally and internally, and saying like, yeah, that's okay. No, that's not safe. And if we get a no, that's not safe, then our brainstem gets activated and we end up in that fight, flight, or freeze response. That can also happen if we sense disconnection or disrespect or a sense of being unloved or not cared for. Any kind of threat to our emotional safety is also a threat to our physical safety, because if we don't belong to the group that we're with, that is a threat to our survival, according to our brains. And so that will activate our stress response. So that is really important, I think, as we talk about what's going on with stress and trauma. Because if someone is in their stress response, they do not have the capacity to think logically or reasonably about what their next behavior is going to be. They're just going to do stuff. It might not make any sense. That's the same for all of us, because we're all human and we all operate in that kind of a way. So having that awareness of the neurobiology of stress, I think, is really foundational to the practice of trauma-informed care. It can help us step back and say, yeah, that is, this does seem like a situation where the person is not able to access their executive functions. And what we need to do first is create a sense of safety for that person. And then we need to build a sense of connection. We all need connection. We all need to feel safe. And when we have those things, then our brains can really use our full capacity, and we can be able to both soothe that dysregulation as well as start to move through healing processes. So just a quick note about the stress response when we think about the fight, flight, or freeze responses. They are oftentimes, we think of them as external responses. So, with fight, we might become combative or, physically aggressive in some way. Flight, we might actually run away, run out of the room. And freeze, we might shut down. But we also sometimes turn those stress responses inward. And while on the outside, we are not fighting, but inside, we've got that critical voice that's saying all the things that we're doing wrong. The flight response might look like numbing out with substances, with social media, with Netflix episodes on repeat, whatever it is you numb out with. That could be a part of a stress response. Or avoiding also could be part of that flight response. The freeze response can also look like rumination, where we get stuck on a thought, on an event, and we just can't get past it. We just get frozen there. So don't discount those other ways of experiencing the fight, flight, or freeze response. It's not always as clear as like physically fighting, running away, or shutting down. The other thing is that it's not always fight or flight or freeze. We just do all of those things, maybe. We might do a couple of them. We might do all three. We might just do one. Kind of depends on how our brains are interpreting the situation and what is most likely to keep us alive in any of those situations. So that's really how that operates. This is important, I think, for understanding trauma, because when we have a traumatic experience, we have a stress response. That stress response can be reactivated by reminders of those past experiences. And that's really where trauma starts to show itself and impact our ability to move forward. Another thing to consider is that safety is not just one thing either. There are lots of different elements or dimensions of safety. My team has worked really hard to try to conceptualize this in many different ways. We have most recently been working with the SAMHSA dimensions of wellness and thinking of those in terms of safety, because really, in order to achieve wellness of any kind, we have to be safe in all of these dimensions as well. So you've got some definitions of all of these in the handout packet, and I'm not going to take a ton of time to go through this tonight because I want to get to some other things, but just want to point out that feeling safe is not a static state of being. It's defined differently for every person, and it's impacted by a lot of factors, including the environment, our interpersonal relationships, our internal responses, our past experiences also shape that. And so we can feel unsafe in the midst of all of those changing factors. I think a lot of times when we think of safety, we do think of physical safety, and that is but one bubble on this slide. And all these other bubbles really, I think, are part of that larger picture of psychological safety. Like, what does it mean to really feel safe and whole? Having safety in all of these different dimensions, I think, contributes to that. And when we don't feel safe in one dimension, oftentimes that is influencing another dimension of safety as well. As an example, I will, a lot of people are talking about healthcare right now in the US, the healthcare system, our insurance processes, and that sort of thing. And that is really creating a huge sense of unsafety for people. I think that plays into not only financial safety, being able to feel like you can afford to take care of your health, but then there's also your actual physical safety in that. There's also, I think, moral safety that's impacted by that. Knowing, having your own sense of what's right and wrong, what should be covered by your insurance. All of those kinds of factors can influence our ability to feel safe in that way also. And then the truth is also we have providers who may or may not maintain a sense of social safety with us or emotional safety as we go to meet with them. They may downplay our symptoms. They may um, they may be clouded by their own bias, which influences their ability to give us an accurate diagnosis. Like there's all of those factors that play out when we start to really dig into why are people so upset about the healthcare situation in the US. So I think having that understanding, being able to kind of look objectively a little more at what might be playing into someone's reaction, someone's response, can be really helpful. The other thing I will say about just the prevalence and experiences of trauma is that they are usually happening in layers. We live in a world that is full of trauma and loss and grief and those things that happen. So in this image, we've got in the tree, those things that happen in the household, in our childhoods. That stuff that's there in the tree, which is very tiny, I know. So let me read off a few of them. Parents who divorce, having homelessness, parental mental illness, alcoholism, drug abuse. Actually, we need to change that because we have some different terminology for some of these things now. Emotional and sexual abuse, domestic violence, maternal depression, bullying, neglect, having a family member who's incarcerated. Those are what have been referred to as ACEs in the past. So ACEs stand for adverse childhood experiences. And those ACEs, there were 10 in the original study that came out in the mid 90s. They surveyed lots of people, I think 17,000 people in the initial wave. And they asked them like what their childhood experiences were. And then they surveyed them also about their health outcomes as an adult. And what they found was that, first of all, 2/3 of people had one of those 10 adverse childhood experiences, 2/3. So that's pretty high prevalence of potentially traumatic events. Now, not all of those people would say, yeah, I have trauma, but they had all of those potentially traumatic events that have definitely impacted them, because what the study found was that then their health outcomes later in life appear to have a correlation to the number of adverse childhood experiences that they had. So the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely it is that you will have an increase in even things like, broken bones and chronic health issues like COPD, cancer, diabetes, like longer, bigger kinds of diagnoses. That was kind of startling for people to recognize that there was that link between what happens in childhood and what happens to us as adults. I think I've worked in mental health for, like 20 years now. And I worked in the state hospital system in Kansas, worked at Osawatomie and Rainbow Mental Health before that. And when I first learned about trauma-informed care, we learned about ACEs. That was kind of the main thing. And I think at that time, this was like mid 2000s when I was learning about that. It was kind of just rolling out in the state hospitals. I think we all had the understanding at that point or before then that if you had a lot of trauma as a kid, yeah, you probably are going to end up with some kind of mental health issue as an adult. That didn't seem out of the realm of understanding at the time. But I think when we started looking at these other physical health impacts, people were like, oh, there's something more here. Like we need to pay a little more attention to it. Now, I will say that if maybe all along we had been paying more attention to the way our physical and mental health intersect, maybe we would have had that understanding already. Anyway, this is where we are. We in the US have really followed a medical model for a long time, and there are benefits to that, but there are also some, I think, detriments when we look at how our mental health and well-being has been cared for. So that was kind of a sidebar, but those ACEs, now we are expanding ACEs, and we're starting to talk about other types of ACEs. So it's not just the adverse childhood experiences, it's also adverse community experiences. Those things there in the soil. So things that a lot of times are really driven by the adverse cultural experiences that are even further in the soil. So things like slavery and genocide and harmful social norms, discrimination, racism, like those things that are really deeply seated in our soil, bubble up and influence what's just under the surface. Some of us, again, depending on those resources that we have available to us, uh, see the outcomes of those adverse community experiences in the soil a little more intimately than others. And those things filter up and influence the adverse childhood and household experiences. And then we also just live in a world, like I said, that is full of trauma. So we've got adverse climate experiences as well, things that are impacting us on major levels in so many ways. So I already talked about the pandemic. We are all sitting here right now in the middle of a snowstorm. I mean, the snowstorm has passed, but we're dealing with the after effects. So it's like I don't know, top 3 snowfalls since they've been recording in Kansas City, I think. It's bad, right? The weather has been interesting over the last few years, like definitely some changes from what we've expected. That impacts us. And then I think the thing that's not depicted on this slide so much are the climate events that are more related to political and social climate. And that I think has really been a huge factor in for lots of people in the last few years, as we look at just how much more people are divided and really feeling dismissed by people around them. I think that that's really important to note too. So there are layers and layers is really what I want to get at, which means when we start to think about how prevalent trauma is, it's again not just those adverse childhood experiences, which was 2/3 of the population. It's also all these other things. So we can pretty much presume that every single person we come in contact with has had some exposure to a potentially traumatic event, at whatever age they are. It's so prevalent. We can, I think, pretty much assume 100%. And even more, if we just treat everyone in a trauma-informed way, whether we know about what has happened to them or not, we're probably going to do okay, because that is going to guide us in being more compassionate and understanding, and really being able to get to the heart of what it means to live together in this world that is full of a lot of pain and stress and trauma, but also is full of joy and love and connection. And so, being in that together and really thinking about how we can heal collectively as well as individually. So I want to pause there because I've said a lot of stuff, and just give you a moment to reflect, share out if you'd like to unmute and say anything or type in the chat. How does this information challenge your previous understanding of trauma or anything else that's coming to mind?
Andrea, this is Vicki.
Mhm.
Did I turn on my camera? Let's see.
You're good. Yeah. I see
Okay.
ya.
All right. Thank you. This is obviously interesting. I think we can all relate to it. And I do appreciate you talking about the ACE score, because when that came on board, that for people, you talk about trauma and people go, oh, it impacts you emotionally. I think this big surprise for me at that point was how it affected people physically
Yeah.
and in their health. In, like you said, the things you mentioned, cancer, respiratory, asthma, I mean, all sorts of things. So that's been a real eye opener for me, and as working with individuals. And it's not just, it's not, I always call it the yuck factor. When I think of post-traumatic stress, people go through usually a yucky experience. But with the ACE, it's often, it's just if they have more than 4 or more of those can answer those questions, and they're not, it kind of builds up, I think, because, were your parents divorced? Did you, you know, were you abused? I mean, and you have several of those things and how that really does impact you with trauma. So I really appreciate it. And this is kind of a little bit off the subject, but I'm just curious why I have you why I'm here. The EMDR, the eye movement. What do you think about that for treatment? Because I've heard some good things. I actually had a student one time who had a really severe trauma, and
Yeah.
it was really a police officer who got her initially into that,
Mhm.
which was interesting.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, like with any therapy, I think each person has to decide if it is going to be
Mm-hmm.
a benefit
Mm-hmm.
to them or not. Though I will say for EMDR, a lot of people have gotten a lot of benefit from it. I have also heard recently that there are some research studies I think coming out. I have not read any of them, so full disclosure, just coming at it from a casual asking the question, giving you what I heard answer. But
Yeah.
I have heard that there are some research studies that are showing that it may be less about the eye movement piece of it, and more about like just the connection that you build with that
Right.
therapist. And so I think that's really interesting and probably important to note too.
Right. There's
Um,
some tapping. People find it for
yeah.
tapping. Anyway,
But I'll
just
also say, you know, I'm a music therapist, so I get into that kind of
mm,
um, you know, a little more out there stuff. So, because
eh,
sensory processing is huge. Like, I mean, that's a big way that we do understand the world around us and understand the world inside of us, and being able to kind of bridge that. And I think EMDR may be a really impactful way to do
yeah.
that for some people. So
Well,
again,
if
probably
we have
depends on
time
the
at the
person.
end, if we have time at the end, and I'll let other people because there's some people in the chat, but because I want to see your connection between your music therapy
Yeah,
background and this. I find it's interesting. I want to hear that story at some point, but you
sure.
may not have time tonight, but
Yeah, we may
I
not
just,
tonight, but
but it is,
we can
I can
chat
see the
another time.
connection. I can see how it can be very beneficial. So thank you. I'll mute myself so somebody else, and then there are some things in the chat.
Yeah, I'll just read off a few here. Someone said, I appreciate how you shared that two people can go through the same event and have a different response, some with trauma, some without. Yeah, I think that's an important point. Another person noted the shift from trigger to activation is interesting. Thanks for mentioning how trauma is not necessarily the event as much as trauma being the energy in the body. Yes, it's how those things get like stuck in us. So, um, uh, another person shared in the chat their experience with the most recent trauma that they've experienced is related to tornadoes. So I think this is a good example of how some people are fascinated by tornadoes, right? I just watched Twisters, the newer Twister movie. And you know, some people it just doesn't seem to phase them at all. They're right in the middle of it and they even are seeing all kinds of devastation around them and doesn't seem to impact them. And yet other people are, you know, impacted for the rest of their lives by one of those events. So it's really again a factor of those internal and external resources and what we have available to us, how we're able to navigate that, what are our previous experiences with a similar potentially traumatic event. Like sometimes that shapes how we move through those. So yes, thank you all for those comments in the chat. Um, Another person mentioned they found EMDR to be quite effective and helpful. Um, yeah, it is pretty remarkable. There are lots of really positive stories, I think, that come out of people who have benefited from it. All right, great. I want to move just really quickly through a couple of slides about the impacts of trauma, and then I'm going to get to like, what do we do about all of this? I mentioned, you know, the multiple layers of impacts that trauma can have. Ultimately, for those who've experienced trauma, which again is like everybody, or dealing with the effects of toxic stress, the world can feel really ominous and chaotic and ultimately unsafe. I think especially if we have unresolved trauma, that's when we really start to feel that sense of maybe impending doom. We may really be hyper vigilant and hyper hyper overreactive to the things that are going on around us because we are just waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? We're just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Because our brains get sort of locked into that stress response. And it's really hard to break out of that when we start to see that. It actually gets reinforced in our brains that things are unsafe because we feel unsafe. And that loop that can really take over contributes to sometimes even more trauma happening for us. So there are some immediate consequences. There's also long-term. They happen in lots of ways, and I gave you a handout that unpacks all of these. There are cognitive impacts, a lot of that related to our brain function, our ability to focus, to remember things, like memory gets impacted quickly when we're traumatized. There's educational impacts. People who experience trauma at a young age sometimes are misdiagnosed with learning disabilities. Sometimes are not able to be successful in like reading tests or IQ tests. They might score lower on those things. It's not necessarily that they can't do it. It's that their brain is not doesn't have the full capacity to be able to navigate those things. Some of our testing also is biased, and we could spend probably a whole webinar talking about that too. There are those neurophysiological impacts, just the development of the brain. So if you have a traumatic event when you're a child with a developing brain, that actually changes your brain architecture. And while our brains are very like pliable and we can relearn lots of things, the impacts of that do last. And we can retrain our brains in lots of ways. Even as adults, though, our brains are continually changing, and so we might have a neurophysiological impact of stress and trauma. Again, especially if we are kind of locked into that stress response, what starts to happen is that just like with a muscle, the more you use it, the stronger it gets. And so if our stress response is activated a lot, that just means our stress response is going to activate a lot. And that actually physiologically can change in our brains. There are also social and psychological impacts. It can be more difficult to connect with other people. It can be challenging to form relationships that are healthy. We can have a lot of inability to cope with conflict, all of those factors that might if you have all your resources available to you, you can navigate it really well. But if you're in your stress response and you lose access to your executive functions on a regular basis, that can make it really challenging. So I don't have a ton of time to go into all of those today, but that is in that handout. And there's tons of research around all of these things too. I also want to, let's see, let me skip that one. I also want to mention that when we are caregivers of any kind for someone who has experienced trauma, that we can have an impact from that too. That's something called secondary trauma. Sometimes we refer to it as vicarious trauma also. Those are a little bit different experiences, but I'm going to lump them together for our purposes tonight. When we have secondary or vicarious trauma, that means that we are impacted by the traumatic experience of someone else. Now that happens in lots of ways because maybe we hear about the experience that they had or we see it happening. I had a dear friend of mine from elementary school all the way through high school. Her little girl yesterday was sledding and had a really terrible accident and was in the hospital. And I was thinking about how, as a parent, seeing your child go through a traumatic experience like that is a trauma, right? Like, I don't think anybody would say it was not a trauma for you as the parent. But sometimes we downplay that for like healthcare workers that are constantly exposed to traumatic events of the patients that they care for. So I think pointing out that that is real, that is a valid experience. If you are a caregiver of someone who has experienced trauma, you probably have the lingering effects of that trauma as well. We share a lot of that stuff in that kind of, I don't know, interpersonal soup that we're all swimming in together. Because we are impacted by each other's stress, and we're impacted by how well we're coping at any given moment. So that is really all I want to say about that for tonight. My team has a whole like 3-hour or more presentation on compassion fatigue and secondary trauma and burnout and how we navigate that as caregivers. I think that that is a really important piece of being trauma informed is acknowledging that and taking care of yourself in that. I mentioned the idea of activation or reactivation, triggers. Just a nod here to the concept that our sensory system is really what is giving us that information that activates our stress response in whether that's through a familiar pathway of a past experience of trauma, or it's a new experience that that we are having that is a threat to us. The sensory system is very, very actively involved in processing those that stimuli and helping us remember. And the way that the sensory system and our memory storage areas in our brain are very closely connected is important. There are lots of ways that we remember things, not with words, but with our senses. And that's why that activation of the stress response can happen just with a smell of something, or a color, or a gesture, any of those kinds of sensory things. We may not have the words to describe it, but our brain knows. Our brain says, hey, that's a dangerous thing, and can activate our stress response. That sensory system is not only those 5 senses of sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste, but also our sense of balance, our sense of body awareness, and also our internal sensations, things like hunger, needing to go to the bathroom, pain, those kinds of things as well. Emotions also are part of our internal sensations, because emotions are not separate from the sensory system. Emotions really are experienced by us as sensory input. So I think that's all a lot of information, but important to note, because at any moment we can have one of those things happen to us, and it can activate our stress response. And our bias plays a role in that. So how we have understood what happened to us before, how we have learned what is safe, what isn't safe, and also biases related to types or groups of people. We make broad assumptions about people based on various qualities about often how they look, especially when we think about what's safe, what's not safe. That's ultimately what our brain is trying to do all the time, is what's safe, what's not safe. Bias, again, happens for all of us because we are human. We live in the world. Those biases are reinforced all the time. And sometimes we inadvertently reinforce our own biases, because what happens is, for instance, if I saw this person and I made this assumption about them based on the type of person they are, and I felt scared. Because I felt scared, they must be dangerous. Like, that's how our brain operates. And it's not logical, right? It's not all entirely rational, especially if they didn't actually do anything to us. But that interpretation reinforces the bias, and it also can reinforce the stress response. So I think the way to address that is to just pay attention. Pay attention to your responses. Work on reducing your stress level. The more stressed we get, from anything, the more stressed we get, the more likely it is we default to our biases. Because stress takes energy away from our brain, our thinking parts of our brain, and our brain just will make even more shortcuts. So that bias really starts to take over if we're stressed. So work on reducing our stress level, especially if we're interacting with people who are different from us, which is probably everybody. And recognizing the ways that we both make assumptions and then choose to do maybe something different in the face of that assumption or bias. So there's a question in the chat about if permanent damage to our memory system if that lasts, like they were told EMDR can help with that. I think that's true. I think what often happens with trauma and memory is that in order to survive, our brains will shut down our memory, our access to our memories, because if our brain like lets us remember, that feels very dangerous, right? So it's protective a lot of times that our memory is impacted. EMDR is one pathway, I believe, that can open us up to remembering those past experiences. So, yes, I think that's, while there could be some element of permanent damage, I don't know that that's true for everybody all the time. I think a lot of people do find success with accessing past memories and that sort of thing with all different kinds of therapeutic modalities. So another quick reflection question, how do you see the impact of trauma and stress in those around you and maybe also in yourself? And if anybody has any quick comments about that, we can do that, but I really do want to get into what do we do about all of this? So a question in the chat, do you have any insight perspectives on body or physical memory after effects years after trauma? Well, I think that kind of aligns with what I was just saying a bit. Again, I'm not like an expert on trauma memory retrieval or anything, but I think your body does remember. Your conscious brain, your conscious mind may not remember, but your body will remember. And I think that's one of the ways that that slide I showed with the sensory system, and that's one of the factors in that. Your body knows those things and will respond to them, even if your conscious mind is unaware. So, you know, a good practice, I think a lot of times people, as they are healing from trauma, what they find is that being able to understand what's happening in their bodies as a trauma response, and then giving yourself what you need in that moment in order to feel safe, if you are safe, of course, and to be able to, I don't know, have that sense of safety for yourself. I think that yeah, I could probably talk about that for a long time, but it is really interesting, memory and trauma, how that plays out. Okay, so let me talk then the rest of the time about what it means to be trauma informed. And the kind of basic 4 elements of becoming trauma informed are, first, to recognize the prevalence, signs, and impacts of trauma, which we've just talked a lot about. And then infuse that knowledge and the shared vocabulary into policies, procedures, and practices. And I want to say here that even if it's not like in your work environment, we all have policies and procedures about how we move through our lives. We have expectations, we have boundaries. Those are all policies and procedures. Maybe we don't have them written down in a manual, but they guide the way that we operate. So those are our personal policies and procedures. And then actively resisting re-traumatization, doing that both for other people, like doing practices that help to reduce the likelihood that somebody will experience trauma again with us, but also being mindful of that for ourselves. And then finally, promoting restoration, well-being, and growth. So my team has come up with these 4 commitments and an action that goes with each one of them. And these really are the guiding elements of becoming trauma informed. So we start with an understanding that all behavior has meaning. It is whatever the person is doing, it is communicating something to us. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. And yet it is communicating to us some sort of need, It might be that what is driving their behavior is the stress response. It might be a past traumatic event that, a lot of times we go through the same patterns again. Our brains like patterns. We like to repeat things again and again. So, that's why we have those of you who are married or in a long-term relationship, you probably have the same fight with your significant other multiple times, right? Like we just do the same things over and again. It doesn't make sense all the time, but that's just what we do. Mine with my husband is about the dishes. We're always fighting about the dishes. It's actually become quite a joke about the dishes in our house that I use regularly as an example. But we've been married for over 17 years and we still have the same fight about the dishes. But when we start to remove ourselves a bit from judgment, which is actually the next commitment, and consider what the underlying needs are of the behavior that the person is doing, and also in that honor cultural differences. The way one person grew up is not the same as the way I grew up. And using the dishes example, I think is a great one. My husband did not grow up in a house that had a dishwasher. And so it's natural for him to put the dishes in the sink. Now, while I didn't grow up in a house that had a dishwasher at first, by the time I was like 10, we had one. And so I learned how to put the dishes in the dishwasher right away. Those kinds of, I know this is kind of a silly example, but that's a cultural difference in our families for how we were raised. And of course, cultural differences are much broader than if we had a dishwasher or not. But I think it's a fair example for right now. The second commitment, like I said, is resisting judgment. So it's natural for us to jump to judgment because we're human. Humans judge. It's how we make sense of the world. It's how we understand who's okay to be around and who's not. So some judgment is important, but a lot of times we're overusing judgment and we're making assumptions about people that are not necessarily true. And sometimes those judgments come in the form of what is wrong with them, especially when it's one of those behaviors that we don't understand. So instead, we talk about in trauma-informed care, changing the question from what's wrong with you to what happened. And we may not actually ask that out loud. It's more about our perspective. We become less judgmental, more objective, better able to see that there are many factors that have led up to this moment in this person's life. And that is the reason why they are behaving or doing whatever it is that they're doing. And we also value lived experience as expertise. No one can tell us what that traumatic experience was like except for the person who had it. And understanding that their ability or their communication to us around what happened to them and what they need right now is important. It's more important than what a diagnosis might be. It's more important than what somebody else says they ought to do. Now, sometimes those things can be helpful. Not to discount diagnosis or things that other people have found to be helpful. That can be helpful. And if it's not helpful for that person, then it's not, right? So we want to also recognize that the way that person has survived up to this point is a strength. Maybe it hasn't always been the healthiest of choices that has gotten them to where they are. Maybe they were just surviving and there wasn't a choice involved. It was about staying alive. But there's a strength in that. Sometimes there are some negative outcomes, health outcomes, that sort of thing that might be damaging to the person. And yet, even in that, there's a strength because they're still here. And if we can dig down into, what is it that is getting this person going, moving forward in some way, even if it's a small step forward, even if it's 5 steps back and 3 steps forward, like that, there's still some strength in there because there were those 3 steps forward. So really being able to see the strengths of an individual is an important piece of trauma-informed care. And then protecting relationships. Relationships are so, so important. We cannot survive without relationship. We need connection with other humans. We depend on each other. And so having collective care kinds of opportunities, looking for ways to show up for other people and putting relationships ahead of things like um, the way we think things should be, um, the way, following a set of rules or expectations is often less important than valuing that relationship. So how do we create a safe and collaborative culture? How do we create environments where people feel like they belong? Because feeling like you don't belong is a threat to your safety, and it is also a trauma. And we don't want to contribute to more traumatization for a person. So creating those opportunities for safety and being together. All right. There are also principles of trauma-informed care. We use the Missouri model principles of trauma-informed care. There are also the SAMHSA principles of trauma-informed care, which are similar but a little different. I'm not going to take time to go into detail about these tonight. You've got them in the handout. But I do want to say safety is really foundational. Without safety, it is virtually impossible for us to experience any of the rest of these principles. Safety is what helps our brains to be soothed in the stress response. Safety is what helps us be able to to uh, find our strengths and to move forward. And experiencing safety in all of those ways that I mentioned earlier really is crucial. So safety, foundational for all of this. They all build from there. We can't really have trustworthiness if we don't have safety. Choices are not meaningful if we don't have a sense of safety, because we may have choices, but we can't actually make the choice that is what we want if we don't feel safe to do that. We don't collaborate really, not really and truly, if we don't feel safe. And we certainly can't feel empowered if our sense of safety is undermined. So check those out. I think that those principles can really guide the way that we try to be trauma informed with other people. And then I do want to give just a few tips about working with people or interacting with people. Working may not be the right word for you, but interacting, supporting those who have experienced trauma. I think one of the really important things is just be aware that something happened before you were in this interaction with the person. I need to edit this slide because it still says triggers. I just noticed that. So be aware of those precipitating events and possible activators of the stress response for the person. Are they behaving in a way that seems to be like a fight, flight, or freeze kind of response? And then what can we do to create a sense of comfort, create a sense of safety for the person? Again, foundational is create safety and then build relationships. So if you walk away from tonight with just those two things, help a person feel safe and help build connection, those two things will take you very, very far in terms of responding to somebody who's experiencing trauma. So thinking about creating comfort, not control, a lot of times our natural response when things start to get heightened is to try to control, because that's our brain, our body's like natural urge is to try to get control of the situation. And what happens then is, especially if we're a helper in that situation, we can actually make the situation worse for the person by trying to control it. That can make that trauma response escalate even further. So again, focus on safety, focus on building relationship, and then also model and promote stress management techniques yourself. Being attuned to your own level of stress and using grounding strategies, practicing mindfulness when you become activated. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this here in a sec. And then model those calm and curious and relational kinds of conversations. When you do that, I've had this experience many times, both as a clinician and as a friend, and also as a parent, as a caregiver, and lots of other capacities too. Being able to just like slow down myself, that has such an impact. You don't always have to have the exact right words to say. In fact, one of the best things you can do in a situation where you're supporting somebody who's experiencing trauma or is activated in their stress response is just to listen and say, what do you need right now? You don't have to have the answers. You don't have to have the right words. Just keep showing up. That's really what people need more than anything, is somebody to show up and love them, right? And I think that that can take us really far. It's hard to do that, though, if we're not in a place of calm ourselves. So I want to talk a moment about trauma-informed self-care as a way to think about how we apply these things to ourselves. So paying attention to our own reactions and responses, observing those patterns, staying out of judgment about ourselves, meeting your needs in healthy ways that, ways that are healthy both for you and for those that are around you. And that's really trauma-informed self-care. Sometimes self-care is like escapism. That's not necessarily trauma-informed. Now, I will say sometimes you do just need to get away for a moment, right? And that might be just fine. If that's the only way that you're taking care of yourself, is to just completely remove yourself from your life, you're not really probably going to be able to manage that ongoing stress that's happening. But we do need a break once in a while. So I want to acknowledge that can be really important too. But sometimes we can't get away. Sometimes we have to keep showing up because we are the person for this situation. And so if you can't leave a highly stressful situation and you feel your stress response becoming activated, we encourage people to think about and prepare for using grounding strategies or rapid resets. So what are some things that can rapidly reset you to your baseline? It's not going to solve all the problems, but it's going to hopefully get you to a place where you can be calm, where you can soothe your stress response and be able to access your executive functions so that you can be more objective and compassionate in the moment. So these are different practices than like going for a walk or doing yoga or listening to music. You might not be able to do those things in the middle of a stressful situation. I'm talking more about things like taking a slow, deep breath. Breathe out for longer than you breathe in, because that will help activate your parasympathetic nervous system. You can also do little, like, almost like games in your head. So I love 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is great for grounding. This is great for anxiety. This is great for falling asleep at night sometimes. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. You're just doing this in your mind. Other people don't even necessarily need to know you're doing it. And it helps to pull that energy from your stress response into some other part of your brain. And that can help to ground you in the moment. I gave you a whole list of grounding strategies and some tips on how to use those in that handout packet. I also want to just mention that your body takes on a lot of stress and holds it. We're not so good at completing our stress response cycle. We're supposed to like have stress activation and then use up those stress chemicals. We don't always do that. So we end up with a lot of adrenaline and cortisol and all of those kinds of things in our bodies. This is why we have so many stress-related health issues. The US is like the top ranked for stress-related health issues. So we need to do things to complete our stress response cycle, because the stress itself will kill you faster than the stressor. Most of the stressors that we have in this life are not like immediately threatening to us. Now, sometimes they are. So get to a safe place. That is priority. If we're talking about stress like the political and social climate, those bigger, long-lasting kinds of stressors, completing the stress response cycle on a regular basis is essential. And it gives your body the resources that you need in order to navigate whatever it is that's going on. So just a few examples, suggestions for how to do that. Move your body. Move it in whatever way you can. That might be different for each of us. Some of us are runners, some of us are walkers, some of us just need to do chair yoga. We just need to move somehow. And doing that on a regular basis is really important for your health. Go outside. I mean, wear a coat today, but go outside in nature, because nature is so restorative and really can help us complete that stress cycle. Doing some deep breaths, laughing, engage in a positive social interaction, make something, create something, do music or art or cook, crafting, whatever it is that that you like. Get or give a hug. All of those things are really, really impactful for our ability to move through that stress cycle. Okay, and I want to point out that my team has built this virtual room of refuge that has lots of resources in it for that kind of trauma-informed self-care. There might be some things that you like and some you don't. We know that everybody's a little different, so we've put a variety of things in there. I invite you to check that out. And finally, I want to just say promoting resilience is really an underlying value of becoming trauma-informed. We all have the capacity to make a better world for ourselves and for those around us. And promoting resilience is not just about our individual need to manage whatever's going on in our lives, but it's also how we show up for each other. And being able to do that together is so much more powerful. And so I feel like the work that NAMI does just aligns so well with this idea of community resilience and how we build a community that can navigate those difficult times together. Hard stuff's probably not going away. I mean, I would love it, right? It would be great if we could just eliminate all the pain and trauma and stress in the world. The reality is it's going to keep showing up probably. And what do we do to make sure that we're all okay, that everyone deserves to be okay, right? So that idea of community resilience, I love this concept and this picture. There's a lot to unpack here. I don't have time to do it, but I wanted to share that with you. Okay, that was a ton of stuff. I only have like 2 minutes. So if there are any questions, we can take those. And I do want you to think though, as we're wrapping up here, like what's one thing that you're going to take away? What's one thing you're going to do differently, pay more attention to? And I also want to just say, if you want to learn more from my team, from the Center for Trauma Informed Innovation, we're just now building an on-demand learning portal. The link is there. And then we also have live events that we do on a pretty regular basis. We also have a podcast, which is just on Spotify. So you can find that and listen to that if you want to hear me and my colleague Roxanne talk to a lot of people about their experiences in trauma-informed care. We really enjoy those conversations. It's amazing to hear the work that people are doing in the world. So invite you to check that out. And of course, you can reach out to me anytime. Always happy to chat more. Okay, that was a lot. Thank you all. What questions, comments, anything lingering?
I was just going to say thank you. That's it. I mean, everything was great. I learned so much. I have so many notes. So thank you so much for doing this tonight.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like you kind of demystified trauma and helped really spell it out. And it's hopeful, like we can overcome this and we can work together to create better environments.
Yeah.
And so I also just want to remind everybody we will be posting this along with her PDF file. And I also have your the last thing you shared. You've got your Spotify playlist or your podcast, and then the portal, the safe portal. So we will share all of this on our Facebook site, our Instagram, and get that out as best as we can, and hopefully put it with our YouTube video that this will be recapped in. So, but thank you so much, Andrea. This was wonderful, and we appreciate you so much. At this point, we're going to go ahead and let everybody go, and we appreciate you. You're welcome to send questions to namijoko@gmail.com, and I'll make sure she gets those if there was anything that we didn't get to address tonight. But feel free to reach out to us, and we'll make sure that Andrea gets that and can get back to you. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.